My husband broke up with me during my parents' funeral. Without any emotion, he said, "You're broke. Your parents left you nothing. Good luck. You're definitely going to need it." But when I checked my bank account the next morning, I gasped. My father had transferred everything before he died. My husband's face was priceless when he found out. I never thought I'd lose everything in a single day. I stood in the cold cemetery, dressed in black, my hands clenched into fists to stop them from shaking. My parents had just been lowered into the ground, and I was too numb to cry anymore. The funeral had been quiet, mostly distant relatives and a few old friends who had known my mother and father long before I was born. It was surreal how fast life could fall apart. Just last week, I had parents. Just last week, I had a family. Now, I had nothing. Or at least, that's what I thought. I barely noticed my husband, Brian, standing beside me. He had been silent throughout the service, showing no emotion, barely even acknowledging my presence. It wasn't that I expected much from him. He had always been distant. But today, on the worst day of my life, his indifference felt like a slap in the face. When the last of the guests finally left, I turned to him, expecting at least some words of comfort. Instead, he looked at me with an expression so cold it made my stomach turn. "You're broke." I blinked at him, not sure I heard correctly. "Excuse me." My voice was barely above a whisper. "Your parents left you nothing," he said, his tone flat, almost bored. I spoke to the lawyer. "There's no inheritance, no assets, nothing. They must have spent it all, or who knows. Either way, you have nothing now." I couldn't even process what he was saying. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, the same way he always did when he was done with a conversation. "Look, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. I can't be with someone who brings nothing to the table. It's already hard enough supporting you, and now? Now you're just dead weight." The wind blew through the cemetery, cold against my skin. I stood there, frozen in place, staring at the man I had married. The man who had just told me, at my parents' funeral, that he was done with me. "I'll have my things out of the apartment by tomorrow." He turned away like he had just finished a business transaction. "Good luck. You're definitely going to need it." Then, just like that, he walked away. I stood there long after he was gone, my breath visible in the cold air, my mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. I had just lost my parents. And now, I had lost my husband, too. That night, I sat alone in our apartment. No, my apartment, I reminded myself. Or was it? Brian had always handled the finances. I had trusted him with everything. I had always thought we were a team. I hadn't eaten all day. I wasn't even sure I had moved from the couch in hours. My body was heavy, my mind exhausted. It didn't make sense. My parents weren't wealthy, but they weren't broke either. They had worked their entire lives, saved everything. My father had owned a small real estate business. My mother had been careful with money. There had to be something. With shaky hands, I reached for my laptop and logged into my bank account. I had barely checked it in the past year, too preoccupied with my parents' illness and the endless hospital visits. Brian had always reassured me that he was taking care of everything. I expected to see a near-empty account. Instead, I gasped. The number staring back at me didn't make sense. There were multiple deposits, large ones. Transfers that had been made within the past 2 weeks. From my father's account. I scrolled through the transactions, my heart pounding. He had moved everything. Every last dollar, every asset, every investment. He had liquidated their savings, their properties, everything they had worked for, and transferred it directly to me. And then, at the bottom of the screen, I saw a message. "Take care of yourself. Don't trust anyone." Daddy sob caught in my throat. He must have known. Somehow, before he died, my father must have known what Brian was planning. That was the only explanation. He had made sure that everything was secure, hidden, before anyone else could touch it. Before Brian could touch it. And Brian had no idea. He had left me, thinking I was broke. He had abandoned me without a second thought, believing I had nothing left to offer him. But I wasn't broke. I was rich. And for the first time in years, I had power. I barely slept that night. Instead, I spent hours going through everything. I hired a lawyer first thing in the morning. I had to know everything. Every account, every asset, every investment my parents had left behind. And that's when I found the second betrayal. Brian had been using my parents' assets as collateral for his business. Without my knowledge, he had taken loans against properties that he had no legal claim to, properties that now belonged to me. He was in deep. I sat in my lawyer's office, listening as he explained just how bad Brian's situation was. His company was barely afloat. The loans he had taken were coming due. And without access to my parents' assets, he was finished. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Brian hadn't just left me. He had planned this. He had been waiting for the moment I was at my weakest. He had assumed that when my parents died, I would inherit nothing, and he would be able to walk away clean, leaving me with nothing. He had bet on my downfall. And now, he was about to lose everything. I didn't tell him. Not yet. I let him believe I was struggling, let him think I was drowning without him. I ignored his texts when he casually asked if I had figured things out yet. I wanted him to feel secure. And then, I made my move. The foreclosure notices went out first. His business assets, the ones he had leveraged using my parents' properties, were seized. His accounts, what little was left, were frozen. Everything he thought he had was gone. It took him 2 weeks to come crawling back. He showed up at my apartment, the one I now fully owned. He looked different. The confidence was gone, replaced with desperation. Natalia, he started, forcing a smile. I think we need to talk. I crossed my arms. Oh, he exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Look, I've been thinking. I was a little harsh. I was going through a lot, and things got out of control. I made a mistake. I let him talk, let him stumble through his excuses. And then I smiled. You thought I was broke, I said, my voice calm. Brian stiffened. I took a step forward, my heart pounding, my hands steady. You thought you could just walk away, leave me with nothing, and move on with your life. But you were wrong. His face paled. What are you talking about? I own everything, I said softly. The properties, the accounts, the business you thought you had, gone. The money you thought you could use, it was never yours. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I watched as the realization hit him, as the truth settled in. The man who had abandoned me at my lowest point now stood before me, powerless. I pulled out the divorce papers and placed them on the table. You're done here, Brian. His face was priceless. And just like that, I turned and walked away, just like he had. Only this time, I was the one leaving him with nothing. Brian's face twisted into something ugly, a mix of disbelief and barely contained rage. You're lying, he said, his voice uneven. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch between us. Let him hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. Let him feel the weight of what was happening. You really think so? I finally asked, tilting my head slightly. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. You don't know what you're talking about. My business has nothing to do with you. I let out a small breath, shaking my head. Oh, Brian, you really thought you were the smartest person in the room, didn't you? I took my phone from my pocket, scrolled through my messages, and tapped the document open. Then, I turned the screen toward him. Recognize this? I asked. His eyes darted to the screen, and I didn't miss the way his jaw clenched. It was a legal document, one detailing how he had taken out loans using properties he had no legal right to use as collateral. Those properties, my parents' properties, now belong to me. So tell me, I continued, if your business has nothing to do with me, then why are these foreclosure notices addressed to you? His face drained of color. I watched as realization seeped in, how his carefully constructed arrogance wavered. You can't do this, he said, his voice shaking now. You wouldn't. I already did. His breath hitched. I felt something shift inside me, something I had never allowed myself to feel before. Power. You walked away from me, I said, my voice calm but firm. You assumed I was nothing without you. But the truth is, you were nothing without me. Brian's hands curled into fists at his sides. This is a mistake. You don't know what you're doing. I gave him a slow, deliberate nod. Oh, but I do. I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm giving you a taste of what you gave me. I'm taking everything back. The money, the properties, the life you thought you could build on my parents' backs. It's all gone, Brian. And guess what? You did it to yourself. He took a shaky step forward. Natalia, let's talk about this. We don't have to. You mean you don't have to? I corrected. His lips parted like he wanted to argue, but he knew I was right. You never thought you'd get caught, did you? I said softly, studying him. You never thought I'd fight back. I was under a lot of pressure, he said suddenly, voice low, urgent. You don't understand the kind of stress I was under. I didn't mean to. You didn't mean to what, Brian? I cut in. Didn't mean to abandon me when I was burying my parents? Didn't mean to steal from me? Didn't mean to throw me away the second you thought I had nothing left? He had nothing to say to that. The silence stretched between us again. Only this time, it was suffocating for him. I could see the wheels turning in his head. Brian had always been good at talking his way out of things, manipulating people into seeing his side of the story. He thought he could do the same now. So I let him try. He took a slow breath, then softened his expression, as if switching to a new tactic. Listen, I made mistakes. I was scared. I thought. You thought I'd be weak. I interrupted, my tone sharp. You thought I'd need you. That's why you walked away without a second thought. You thought I had nothing left, and you were so sure that I'd crumble. He exhaled, rubbing his temples, looking more flustered than I had ever seen him. How long were you planning this? He asked finally, his voice quieter now. I lifted one shoulder in a half shrug. Does it matter? Brian scoffed, shaking his head. You think this makes you powerful? That screwing me over makes you better than me? I let out a short laugh. No, Brian. Me surviving you makes me better than you. His jaw clenched again. He had no argument against that, no defense for what he had done. I reached into the folder on the coffee table and pulled out the final piece of my revenge. The divorce papers. His eyes flickered to them, and for the first time since he walked in, I saw fear. Not of losing me. No, Brian had never loved me, not in the way a husband should love his wife. But the divorce? It meant something much worse for him. It meant that I was the one leaving him now. I slid the papers across the table. Sign them. Brian stared down at them, unmoving. His hands trembled slightly at his sides. He was trying to mask it, but I could see it. This isn't over, he muttered, his voice low. I smirked. Oh, it is. You just don't know it yet. A long silence stretched between us before he exhaled, running a hand over his face. You're making a mistake, Natalia. I tilted my head. Funny. That's exactly what I thought when I married you. Brian's nostrils flared, his fingers twitching like he wanted to throw something. He had lost control, and he hated it. But there was nothing left for him to do. Nothing left for him to take. I had won. And the best part? He had no one to blame but himself. Brian didn't sign the papers. Not yet. Instead, he sat there, staring at them like they might somehow disappear if he just glared hard enough. You really thought this through, didn't you? He finally muttered. I tilted my head, giving him a slow, measured look. You didn't think I'd roll over and cry forever, did you? His jaw clenched. I never wanted to hurt you. I let out a dry, humorless laugh. Brian, you broke up with me at my parents' funeral. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. I thought you had nothing left. That it would be easy? I finished for him. He didn't answer. Of course he had thought it would be easy. That was the entire point of his plan. He had waited until I was at my lowest, convinced that grief would keep me too weak to fight back. But what he hadn't counted on was my father's final move, transferring everything to me before he died. And he definitely hadn't counted on me turning the tables. I tapped the divorce papers with my fingertips. Go ahead. Sign them. He let out a slow breath, his eyes flicking to mine. And if I don't? I smirked. Then I'll make this a lot harder for you. For the first time in our entire marriage, Brian was outmatched. I could see it in the way his hands curled into fists, the way his jaw tightened as he weighed his options. He was a businessman. He understood leverage. And right now, I had all of it. The divorce wasn't just a formality. It was his last shot at walking away with even the smallest shred of dignity. Because if he fought me on this, I'd ruin him. He knew it. I knew it. But men like Brian, men who thrived on control, on power, they never gave up easily. Which is why I wasn't surprised when he suddenly leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest, his eyes narrowing. You're enjoying this, he said, voice low. I smiled. A little, yeah. He scoffed, shaking his head. You're not the woman I married. My expression didn't waver. No, Brian. I'm finally the woman you were afraid I'd become. He swallowed hard, looking away. Silence. Then, after a long pause, he exhaled sharply and reached for the pen. I watched as he signed his name, his strokes tense and angry, his entire body radiating frustration. When he finished, he pushed the papers toward me without a word. I took them, glanced them over, and nodded. It's done, I said simply. Brian sat there for a moment, looking at the papers like they might somehow betray him. Then, he let out a bitter chuckle. You really think this is a win for you? He asked. That money won't bring your parents back. Won't fix what's broken inside you. His words were meant to cut. But the thing was, I wasn't broken anymore. I leaned forward slightly, my voice quiet but firm. You don't get to define my healing, Brian. You don't get to tell me what I need or what I don't. You had your chance to be there for me. And instead, you left. That's your legacy. That's who you are. He flinched. Just for a second. But I saw it. I had won. And he knew it. I stood up, taking the divorce papers with me. You can see yourself out. He didn't move right away. For a moment, I thought he might say something else. Try one last desperate attempt to regain control. But then, finally, he stood. He looked around the apartment, my apartment, and exhaled sharply. Then, without another word, he walked to the door. He hesitated for only a second before stepping out. And just like that, he was gone. But I wasn't finished yet. The next few months were interesting, to say the least. Brian thought he'd get back on his feet. Thought he could rebuild. He was wrong. Turns out, the loans he had taken weren't just dangerous. They were reckless. Once I had taken back the properties he had leveraged, the banks came knocking. And since Brian no longer had access to any of my parents' assets, he had nothing to back his debts. One by one, his business deals crumbled. One by one, his investments fell apart. The business he had built on lies? Gone. And the best part? I never had to lift a finger. Brian had destroyed himself. All I did was take back what was already mine. The final goodbye. I ran into Brian one last time, months later. It wasn't planned. I was at a coffee shop in downtown Manhattan, reading emails on my phone, when I heard a voice I hadn't expected to hear again. Natalia. I looked up, and there he was. Except he wasn't the same man anymore. Brian looked different. His suit wasn't tailored anymore. His hair was slightly unkempt. There was a hint of exhaustion in his eyes that had never been there before. He had lost weight, not in a good way. It was clear. Life had not been kind to him. I took a slow sip of my coffee before setting it down. Brian. He hesitated before sitting across from me, like he wasn't sure if he was welcome. He wasn't. I heard about the business, I said casually, tilting my head. That must have been devastating. His jaw tensed. You knew what would happen. I smiled slightly. No, Brian. You did this to yourself. He exhaled sharply, looking away. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, finally, he muttered, I lost everything. I didn't respond. Because, honestly, that was his problem. Brian had spent our entire relationship betting against me. He had counted on my weakness. And in the end, that was the bet that cost him everything. He looked at me then, something unreadable in his expression. If I could go back, I cut him off with a small smile. But you can't. Silence. And that was when it hit him. There was no fixing this. No undoing it. No getting back what he lost. I had moved on. And he was nothing but a chapter in my past. He nodded slowly, standing up. For the first time, there was no smugness in his expression. No confidence. Just a man who had lost everything. Goodbye, Brian, I said softly. He swallowed hard, nodded once, and walked away. This time, I was the one who watched him leave. And I never looked back.